This is an exclusive excerpt from the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder.
Diane Auten is back on the program with us. She's an interpersonal communication expert and the author of The Joys of Raising Boys, The Good, the Bad, and the Hilarious. She says women have some misguided ideas about men. For example, it's not true that men aren't emotional beings, or that just because they aren't looking at you doesn't mean they are not listening to you. Diane joins us on the line right now from California. Hi, Diane.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for having me on.
Nice to have you back on the program. We spoke about their book the last time and some of the funny things little boys say, and as you found out, just raising a couple yourself. This is also an interesting topic, too, and the reason why it caught my eye when I saw the little blurb about it is the second part of the example that I gave in the headlines, and that is, or the introduction, the idea that just because they aren't looking at you doesn't mean they're not listening to you. I bring that one up because I remember a study that I had seen several years ago, probably in the late 70s, early 80s, where they put two little boys in a room together and two little girls in a room together, and two chairs were in the room, but they were not side by side. They were just two chairs separated from each other, and they were told to take the chairs and sit down and talk.
Mm-hmm.
And the two little girls took the two chairs and put them so they were almost touching knees. They were looking at each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the two boys put the chairs against the wall side by side.
Yes.
And to me, that said everything.
That doesn't surprise me one bit. In fact, most of the research supports that very idea, that little boys from the time they're small and they're playing whatever games they're playing, most boy games happen side by side. So whether it's Legos, I have a pack of boys at my house right now that are between the ages of 13 and 15. It's a random rainy day in California. It doesn't happen very often, so they're all inside. And they're all sitting side by side. They've been playing video games, doing board games. But when you look at little girls, they're socialized, if you look at the games they play, to look at each other. Most of their games, whether it's dolls, mommy, baby, school, there's a lot of intensive eye contact. And so for that study you're referencing, that makes total sense. Most little girls are very comfortable sitting knee to knee, having that direct, intense eye contact, where most boys, because they haven't been socialized that way, are not very comfortable doing that. So it doesn't surprise me that those boys pulled those seats side by side. Very common.
And taking that one step further, I know from my own personal experience, just being a guy, having great emotional conversations with either women or men, for
Mm-hmm.
me, they've taken place while I've been driving.
Yes, there's a definite magic to a car ride. And I would throw in there, Peter, too, especially with, I have teenage boys, so my boys are now 13 and 15, and they're budding adult, men as well. We have the best conversations, not only in the car, but in the dark. So if you can get them in the car at night, that's another great way to have those really wonderful conversations with the men in your life, whether they're young men or adult men. Most men, when they don't feel like they have to have eye contact, will open up so much more. And that's with my boys, where I really have those beautiful, just very revealing conversations about what's going on in their life, how they feel. They're very hesitant to have those same exact conversations. Like, I took my son to dinner the other night, and we were sitting facing each other, and I was trying to have that kind of a conversation, but he just was not having any part of it because he was having to look at me. And so it didn't mean he wasn't listening to me, that he wasn't interested in talking to me about those things. However, later that night, I was sitting in, my boys share a bedroom, and we were sitting in the bedroom. They were in bed, and I was sitting in a chair, and the lights were out, and we were talking, and then that's when the floodgates opened, when they didn't feel like they had to have that eye contact. And so for most women, we correlate this idea of people looking at you and eye contact with listening. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that if a man's not looking at you, that he's necessarily listening or not. It could go either way. But what women do when they make the mistake of thinking that just as a man is not looking at them, that man is not listening. And that could not be farther from the truth.
Okay, so how do we change that perception that women have of men? And I mean, here we are talking to someone, you are a professional, you're an interpersonal communications expert and the author of a book that talks about things like this.
Yes.
And yet you just said you tried to get into a conversation with your son at dinner and he wasn't having it. So
Yeah.
how do you get past trying to do what apparently genetically guys aren't capable of doing?
Well, and let me throw in a caveat there too. Most of the research points at that it's a combination of both nature and nurture. So it's not that boys or men aren't able to do that. It's that they've been socialized to not have that eye contact. So my boys, I've socialized them from early age to have those conversations. So even though it's still not comfortable and they don't talk to their friends with that directed eye contact, we do get to have some of those good conversations still face to face. So I don't want your listeners to get the impression that men don't have the ability to sit and look at you and have a conversation. However, I would say, so back to your question, as a female, and I'm trying to communicate with my husband, for example, who's pretty masculine in the way that he communicates. And part of it for me is to just recognize, first of all, time and place. So when I was asking my son questions at dinner, we're under this super bright light. He's kind of distracted with other things. That was an error on my part because the timing was off. So think about time and place. And I go back to your talking about the car. Like, that's a great time and place to bring up those conversations. So I think as women, sometimes we corner our men to talk to us in times and places that are maybe not the most comfortable for them to open up. So to think about, well, when can I have this conversation? Sometimes when you are dying to have the conversation, you just have to take a step back. I do this all the time and go, is this the right time and place? And if it's not, I wait until it is the right time and place, and then the results are just so much better.
Now, do you think the idea, as I said in the introduction, that women have some misguided ideas about men, is this the female equivalent of a guy who, when they're talking to a woman and asking her what's bothering her, that he just can't stop at listening as opposed to wanting to fix the problem?
Mm-hmm. So that's that knight in shining armor syndrome that a lot of men have, is that, and they're doing the fixing or trying to do the fixing with good intentions. That's what I think as women we need to understand. Men have good intentions when they're trying to help us solve a problem. And the male culture, which is very much a culture, and women have kind of their own culture too, is about fixing things. It's very goal-oriented, very linear, straightforward, to the point. And so when I come home from work, for example, and let's say I tell my husband, oh my gosh, I hate my job. I have all these extra responsibilities and I'm not getting paid for any of them, and I'm going on and on. A typical male response would be, what do you think, Peter? If I'm going on and on and on about how much I hate my job.
Well, either quit your job or get another job or...
Yes, exactly. So that's the typical male response is, well, why don't you quit? And as a woman, I don't want to quit my job. I just want to talk about the fact that I am unhappy at my job. And so as a woman, I just want him to listen to me. But as a man, men get so frustrated with women because they're like, they complain and complain. I tell them what to do. They don't do it. And then they just keep complaining. But I think if men were to step back and recognize, okay, she just needs to vent. And my husband, I have him really trained, for lack of a better word. So when I start doing stuff like that, he will say, do you want me to listen to you or do you want me to give you advice? And sometimes I say, I just want you to listen. And he says, okay. So he'll just sit and listen and have those really good, great responses are things like, that sounds like it's really hard. Wow, how did you handle that? Things like that, rather than trying to give me solutions, because I don't want to quit my job. I love my job. I'm just having a bad day. And so I think both men and women can learn from each other in those situations. We all have good intentions. Those men are trying to help. And as women, we have to understand that too and not get frustrated when they do try to solve our problems.
Is part of the problem on the men's side in dealing with what we just described, the fact that women do want to vent and just get it out, not necessarily get answers, but men don't vent.
Right. And men, again, I go back to being socialized. A lot of times men have been socialized to withhold, especially feelings of vulnerability or emotions of vulnerability. And by that, I mean things like things aren't going well at their job, or if they're talking to their friends, for example, maybe they're having troubles in their intimate relationship, but that is an emotion of vulnerability to be able to express that to their friends and really explain and dive into their feelings about that. And so men oftentimes really shut down when it comes to those emotions of vulnerability. They don't want to talk about, doesn't mean they don't want to, they just honestly probably aren't comfortable with it or really know how to express those emotions, because we've told our little boys since they were little to hide their emotion, to grow a pair or suck it up, or all those other things we tell our boys.
Or worse yet,
we don't want them.
Or worse yet, man up.
Man up, all that stuff. I mean, think about those things we tell our boys, and then they grow up and they've learned all along to hide their emotions and their feelings of vulnerability, and they become adult men. And then as adult women, we want to get into a relationship with these adult men, and then all of a sudden we're angry because they're not emoting and they're not sharing. But they've been taught all along not to do that. And so I think as women, we have to be patient with the men in our life. And it doesn't mean that we can't get them to start opening up. It doesn't mean they don't want to open up. They just really have never practiced that. They don't know how. And so as partners to these adult men, I think women sometimes get angry. And I know with my husband, sometimes I get frustrated if he doesn't want to express himself, although he's pretty expressive. But I have to be patient with him. And if I can get him in the car, I go back to all those other things we just talked about. It really helps him to open up and to talk to me.
Diane, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program. It's always enlightening. I thank you very much for being on the show with us once again.
Thank you, Peter. I appreciate your time.
Diane Auten, author of The Joys of Raising Boys, The Good, the Bad, and the Hilarious. You can go to my website at thestuffile.com, check out the page for this show, which is show number 0491, and you'll find links to Diane's page, plus links to either Amazon.com or Amazon.ca, where you can order her book directly.
You've just heard an exclusive excerpt from the Stuff File program with Peter Anthony Holder. To hear any or all of the full hour-long shows, visit thestufffile.com. Stuff is spelled S-T-U-P-H. That's thestufffile.com. A presentation of Flying Fish Communications.